This is when we really need background music. You know, everyone's looking terribly serious, watching these numbers climbing.
I might use that as the moment to kick off, Hilary. Thanks
Sorry.
for breaking. No, not at all. Thanks for breaking the awkward silence. My name's Luke Murphy. I'm head of the Cross-Party Environmental Justice Commission at the Institute of Public Policy Research. And thank you so much for joining this event today. The event today is really all about how communities across the UK are working to address the climate and nature crises in their local community, while also tackling other problems that they're facing, from poverty to job creation and as we'll hear from the authors of the report in a second, a whole range of activities. And it's a report that we launched earlier today. We were really grateful for the support of local trusts in supporting IPPR in producing this report. And today we're going to hear from the authors and hear about, in their words, how they believe, in the title of the report, communities can thrive in the age of the climate crisis, or in the face of the climate crisis. And then we're going to hear from some fantastic speakers who are going to provide a response both to the report, but also their own perspectives on the roles of community in addressing the climate and nature crises. After the panel debate, we will have an opportunity for questions. So please do consider putting your questions into the Q&A box. You're more than welcome to use the chat function to have a debate and discuss amongst yourselves. But if you would like to put a question to the panel, please do put that in the Q&A function. But first off, I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to our fantastic speakers, and then I'm going to hand over to the authors of the report. So today we're going to be joined by Jonathan Webb, who's a Senior Research Fellow at IPPR North, and also Lucy Stone, who is a climate writer and strategist, who collaborates with a number of organisations through her organisation, Our Common Climate. And Lucy and Johnny were two of the authors on the report. So they're going to give a brief overview of the report's findings. And then we're going to hear from Hilary Benn MP. And Hilary has been a Labour Member of Parliament for Leeds Central since 1999. He's a former Secretary of State at the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs under previous Labour governments. And he's also a co-chair of IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission. We're also joined by Afshin Rashid. And Afshin is the co-founder, director and CEO of Repowering London. And she's also the chair of Community Energy England and a trustee on the board of Friends of the Earth. And last but not least, I'm delighted to say we're joined by David Tudgy, who is the project development manager of Ambition Lawrence Weston, one of the fantastic community organisations who we profile in the report. And I'm not going to steal David's thunder. I'm going to allow him to tell you all about the fantastic work that they've been doing at Ambition Lawrence Weston in just a moment. But in the meantime, I'm just going to hand over to Lucy and Johnny, who are going to give a presentation on the findings of the report. Lucy and Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you everyone for joining. So as Luke said, this is the question we set out to answer: is how are communities thriving in a climate changing world? So we wanted to look not just at the actions that the communities are taking to reduce carbon emissions, but we also wanted to look at how communities are already starting to adapt to some of the impacts we're already committed to. And then lastly, we wanted to look at how communities are preparing for the changes that we are committed to under the net zero transition. So we took a broad lens look at this question. We conducted interviews with a range of organisations, from researchers to funders to community groups themselves. We did a literature review, and then we wrote up some case studies that give a bit of a deep dive into some of the projects. So if you can move to the next slide, Johnny. So what we found is, yes, a huge, as Luke said, huge variety of projects across the UK, often very under the radar, across all sectors of the economy. So from transport to energy to heating and to food initiatives. There's a huge number of projects. And what was interesting is, because we took this broad lens, we found that a lot of these projects are not actually initiated primarily out of a concern to reduce carbon emissions and address climate change. They're often about improving local area, about addressing inequality, maybe providing jobs and local revenue. Climate is often the secondary outcome, it's the co-benefit rather than the other way around. And this is the real benefit of these projects, is that they really tap into a real motivation of people to want to get involved in the project and shape them and steer them. But perhaps because they're not often positioning themselves as climate projects is perhaps why they're a bit under the radar and haven't had so much attention from the climate community. So this is the huge range of projects that we found. And the other thing we found looking at this range of projects is, they're often very little funding for community climate projects. The policy environment is often hostile, definitely not supportive. And as I said, they're not getting the same level of attention. We also found that although community denotes perhaps small voluntary-led projects, indeed, a lot of them do depend on voluntary time to run the project. But actually, we found a number of projects that are, in fact, quite ambitious, large, and commercial scale projects that are creating assets and resources. So for example, here in this picture, you can see a community solar field and wind turbines. These are not small projects, these are projects that can bring in a significant revenue for a local area. And so community perhaps doesn't do justice to some of the scale of some of the projects. So just moving to the next slide, what we found is often the climate space is dominated by a conversation about the much needed state-led intervention, but of course we need state leadership on climate change, systemic problem, and a shift away from just focusing on individual attention. If we move to the next slide, what we found is these projects that we call the local climate commons. So these are projects that are creating or taking local stewardship over resources, whether that's under a cooperative model or a land trust model. There are a number of models, but these, what we're calling our climate commons projects, they really open up the possibility space in climate action away from a narrow focus on individual and state-led change into this space of collective action. And as we said, and that's where the motivations are far broader than just motivations about reducing carbon emissions and climate change. Community ownership under the commons, as we describe it, really presents opportunities to involve people in the transition to net zero, not just consult them, not just make change happen to communities and people, but give them a stake in the new economy that we're transitioning towards. And finally, on the last slide, just to summarize some of the ways in which we see community action, if it was scaled up, if it had more attention, how it could potentially help accelerate progress to net zero, accelerate the chance of remaining within 1.5 as that window closes and we run out of time. So community action has the potential to really increase the political mandate. So it really can create consensus for decarbonisation in a way that campaigning is in a very different way to campaigning. So for example, community-owned wind projects can have very different levels of planning support and local support because they're owned and benefiting the local area. They can create social support. We know engagement in new technology can improve when it's happening at a community level. So examples there are solar contagion. We know that happens when somebody puts a solar panel on their rooftop of a village, puts a solar panel on the top of a school. There could be copycat projects and you can lead to a proliferation of other rooftop solar projects. It can also create agency. We know how climate change can really lead to a sense of apathy and lack of agency in such a huge pressing global issue. It can create agency because it creates tangible change at a collective level, not just at an individual level. So food growing initiatives, for example, bring community together to create affordable food that's produced without high carbon input. And it's tangible, it's visible, you see your change rather than just having to lobby for change from government and wait for government to act. And lastly, it can be more effective. Obviously, communities know what's best for their area, it's where people are based. And it can mean the transition, when led by local areas, are tailored appropriate to the local context. Obviously, obviously the transition to net zero looks very different community to community. So these are some of the ways in which adding the local climate commons into the mix, into the climate space, could really amplify the state-led interventions that we need to happen. It could really build momentum and create political mandate. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the findings that we found in our report. And I'm going to pass over to Johnny, who can talk you through some of the recommendations that we came up with of how we could put this into action through changes. Over to you, Johnny.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. So in terms of the key recommendations of the report, there's a lot in there. So the first thing is I would recommend that you all try and read the report if you get the chance. But in terms of how we decided to think about these recommendations, we call for two things. The first is what we're calling the paradigm shift. So as Lucy explained, communities are already doing a lot, but what we need to do to catalyse community action further is allow them to do more. So as part of that, we think that devolving resources and power downwards towards communities is a key part of the policy action which needs to take place to further community action. Secondly, we call for what we're terming the mindset shift. So essentially that's recognising that already communities are doing so much, but actually there's more they could do. And a lot of the time, even though they're achieving good outcomes and they're achieving good climate outcomes as well as good social outcomes, they're not necessarily recognising that that action is action to tackle the climate crisis. So the mindset shift is basically a set around recommendations to further develop the mindset of communities and others so that they recognise and better align their activities along a spectrum to join up social, economic and climate action. So in terms of the paradigm shift, we believe the key part of that is devolution. And what this should help achieve is legislate for community rights so that communities have the right to organise and have their decisions respected. Establish community rights to own and manage. We think there's loads of really great examples in the report of how communities can do this. And actually there's a really strong case for putting communities in charge of their own assets and letting them manage them. Thirdly, creating a community wealth fund to encourage and enable communities to further expand their ownership of assets. In terms of ambition, we think that as part of this, there needs to be clear ambition there in terms of setting the goal for increasing community-owned green assets. At the minute, that's a relatively small amount of the type of assets available to tackle the climate crisis, and we think there's a really good case for expanding community assets. And we need to support communities to build their green assets, which could include creating space for community groups and local authority decision-making. At the minute, those spaces don't often exist, and we think that communities really have a great deal to input into those processes, and also support them to create new ownership opportunities through joint ventures between local authorities and community groups. And it's important to add just at this point, these obviously aren't all our recommendations, but these are some of just the key recommendations. And finally, in terms of the mindset shift, we think that more can be done to help enable local communities. So ensure that they have the resources and the support they need to develop new plans for action, which emphasises inclusion, community cohesion, and collective action when addressing climate action. This for us was a real take home of the research. We think these are the really important key principles that communities should be putting at the heart of their community action. In terms of wider civil society, we think there's a role to be played in terms of motivating them to work together and build a large sectoral voice that goes beyond sector-specific contributions. At the minute, there's loads of great examples of things being done, but too often it's segmented and broken down by sector. And actually, we think more could be done to join up those different initiatives and really give voice to the community movement. And finally, we think it's really important to encourage philanthropic funders to pursue trust-based funding and create a pooled fund for community action. Some of the most successful cases of where community action has been effective has basically been when communities are put in charge to pursue their own efforts to tackle the climate crisis. And actually, we think so much can be achieved by giving those communities agency and trusting them to spend the resources that they need to tackle the climate crisis. And that's it. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Lucy and Johnny. And as both Lucy and Johnny said, I think the key thing actually is you might expect me to say this is to read the report, but it's not just for our kind of analysis and recommendations. It is just the sheer breadth of examples of activities that are happening across the UK, and as Lucy said, really in a large part under the radar. There are so many great examples that are worth reading more about, and we certainly found in conducting the project that it was really inspiring just to know how much was actually going on. Do continue putting your questions in the Q&A. I can see that there are already some questions coming through. Obviously, feel free to discuss in the chat as well, but do put your questions through the Q&A function if you can. I'm going to turn to Hilary first now to get his response on the report and thoughts on the way forward. Hilary.
Well, thanks very much, Luke, and a big thank you to you, Lucy, and to you, Johnny, for the report and the presentation. I mean, reflecting on what you said, and you alluded to it, Lucy, it can often seem when one looks at the scale of the climate change challenge and what we need to do to tackle it, that it's so big, it's so remote, it's so difficult, it's so large, it can immobilize us. Whereas actually what you've demonstrated in the report, and I love that photograph of the solar field, the turbines, and what really struck me about the picture was all those happy smiling people. Because when you present change and the future and it looks like that, well, what is not to like? And I hope other people will look at that and think, oh, great, how can we do that in our community, especially if we're going to make some money and generate electricity in a renewable way. I noticed, by the way, there was a question on the chat about hydrogen as opposed to electricity. And I would just say, I mean, there are two ways of producing hydrogen. There's blue hydrogen by burning natural gas, and there is green hydrogen using renewable electricity and electrolysis. And we're going to need a lot of green hydrogen in the future, because we may well be heating our homes that way, as well as powering our buses, and in due course, creating, in effect, an energy store. Because one of the great challenges with renewables is when the wind isn't blowing, do you get all the power you need? That's why you have baseload capacity in the system. It was coal in the past, it's gas, some of it is nuclear. And also, when the wind is blowing a lot, what do you do with all the electricity that nobody wants? And if you can use that to create hydrogen, which you then store and burn when you come to need the electricity to produce it, well, that may well be what part of our energy system is going to look like in the future, though I very strongly support local energy schemes. And we're going to hear, I'm sure, a lot from Afshin about that in a moment, because I know of the work that you and your organization have been doing. Second reflection is that we can draw inspiration from the COVID pandemic and the response. Because I am really struck when I look at my constituency, and it's the same up and down the country, this crisis has arisen and communities have jumped into action to feed people, to ring them up, knock on the door, see if they're okay, to do their shopping. It's been extraordinary and wonderful and inspiring and uplifting to see this. And it shows that you can do it. When the needs are there, people will say, well, I'm up for that, and others will come and volunteer. I think the wildlife trusts are a fantastic example of this, because we're talking here about the natural environment as well as climate. And when I was doing the environment job, to travel around the country to see what wildlife trusts are doing, acquiring new bits of land. And I do like the community right to manage idea that is in the report, because this network of well-managed, biodiverse bits of land is expanding all the time around the country, and supporters and volunteers and the trusts are doing a wonderful job. I'm glad you mentioned flood defense, because we've got a huge task of adaptation. And if you think of the coastline, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of coastline around the United Kingdom, and even with the largest flood defense budget in the world, it's going to be a bit challenging to maintain all of those. So increasingly, farmers and landowners are having to try and repair flood defences themselves. and that is quite important. What are the tools that people need? Devolution of power, the ability to do things. They need support, they need advice and information, they need funds to draw on. So looking at the picture of the people in the field with the solar farm, someone would say, well, where do you get the money to do all of that? Did you raise that yourselves? Did you get a loan? How did it work? And knowing where to go and to trust the sources of advice and the partners with whom you might work seems to me to be really important. And finally, you need leadership. And that's yes, about individuals, because a lot of projects, when you ask, well, how did this all happen? The story will unfold. Well, X started it, they had an idea or something happened to them, or they decided this was going to be a cause they would take up. And then leadership from the community by other people coming along and saying, yep, I can give you a hand with that. So I think this is a terrific report, and I think it's a really important part of what we need to do alongside the big stuff that only governments can do to make sure that we get to net zero carbon. Thanks.
Many thanks, Hilary. You've certainly started off a lively debate on hydrogen versus in the chat, so I'll let you digest that.
Right.
But I think you're absolutely right. That point about, I think too often when we think about leadership and climate leadership, we think about, people assume we're talking about world leaders, but actually it's very much about there's a lot of leadership that can and already is being taken in communities. And on that note, I shall hand over to Afshin to tell us a little bit about her thoughts on the report and also some of the work that they're doing. Afshin.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and really welcome the report and its recommendations. And really grateful that someone's out there calling out for that paradigm shift to put communities at the heart, and there's something that we've been talking about for a while. So great to see it there. I'm going to share my reflections based on my experience of community energy. And I wanted to respond to some of the questions you had put to me earlier, which was, how do we encourage the growth of this community action? And I want to share the example of one of our projects in North Kensington. It didn't exist 2 years ago. There was no existing community network around the environment in the borough. And, there wasn't much happening. But there was a lot of voices of concern around pollution, about tackling climate change, about doing something in the community. And came Repowering as an organization, which helped create that spark in the community. We came in as an enabler, and to share our experience of what was happening and what we were doing in Brixton. So we shared our knowledge, our insights with community activists, leaders, and people who shared this agenda. We co-created a vision, and because Repowering had done similar projects before and been there before, we were able to provide that security net for the community to be able to, for the volunteers to be able to participate, for them to be growth and progression, and someone to steer and advise. And what was a real key ingredient was also that collaboration at a local level with the local authority, with the councillors, as equal partners and sharing that agenda, and with wider stakeholders. And of course, without startup grant funding, how would Repowering have been able to sustain our activities in the local area? And, do feasibility studies, as Hilary was saying, you need the money from somewhere. And that kickstarted that movement within the north of Kensington and around the Ladbroke Grove area. And now today, 2021, NKC, which is North Kensington Community Energy, is a co-op with over 200 members, with over 200 kilowatts of solar generation capacity created on schools and community centres and a leisure facility. And all that dynamic energy that's come forward, not just to see more energy generating in the borough, but to tackle climate change, to address fuel poverty, to improve the air quality in the borough, to providing opportunities for young people. So what's gone from not being there or not visible, we've created something, and there's some key ingredients, and there's really chime very closely with the recommendations you put in around that Commonwealth funding, that The example I've described is that of a local climate commons, as you were calling it. And it really chimed with me. All of those ingredients are so essential for us to see more and really see that scale and growth of community across community-led approaches, not just in one borough, but across every borough. Everyone should have access to that model and ability to scale and provide their own local solutions. I think it's really important to talk about the interaction between community-led approaches, community organizations, enterprises with government at a national level, at a local level. And that mindset shift that you're talking about, it's not just in the community, but as well in government. And what we really need is a level playing field for community businesses and enterprises to operate. The market that currently exists and the regulations and the policy really serve a more larger scale, national-based infrastructure, not local. What we want is decarbonized, a decentralized, localized energy system. And that shift it requires incentives, support. Because at the moment, community enterprises like ours can't really participate, because it isn't a level playing field. So some of your recommendations are really aligned with around that targets for community-owned green assets, for communities to have the rights to own and manage, and building that in as integral to policy and decision-making is absolutely key for us to have the marketplace to enable us to flourish and develop new business models and new approaches. So really agree with that. And I would add as well that shift in culture within local authorities, to break their boundaries, to share their problems, not to have that insular kind of risk-averse culture. And it's over years of work and standard traditional practices. But if we are going to innovate, and if we're going to really transform, we really need to reach out and collaborate and be more integrated as a society, not just look at government and politics as separate to the people and the community. So we really want to see that shift in that culture embedded within community. I want to see local authority officers to be emboldened and empowered to come to meetings and clearly share their challenges, and let's create those solutions together. And my final message, was around how do we bring more people with us, and particularly those who are marginalized or disadvantaged. And I think there is something there around green jobs and green skills and the green economy. And we have to invest in the young people. Young people are our future green leaders, innovators and business leaders. And we really need to make sure that it is inclusive and that young people from disadvantaged communities and those marginalized communities are able to have the support to be part of these internships, apprenticeships and jobs and skills agenda. It's today, people can't afford to have an internship that is unpaid. They have to get work where they're being paid. And just recognizing those inequalities and those barriers of lack of role models. We have to, as communities, take responsibility, as civil society and organizations. But I think there is something that to unlock really to make that future inclusive is about empowering our young people. So I'd leave you with that.
Amazing, thanks very much, and really inspiring as well. And I think that kind of marries up with, as you were saying, a lot of the key messages in the report. I think that point around it's not just about the ownership of the process, so greater engagement with communities, but it's have genuine ownership over assets and the benefits of the transition as well. And also your point about it being inclusive, I think that's a key point in the report. And while progress has been made, there's definitely a lot more to do on that front, and that's something that the report sets out as well. But thanks very much. Last but not least, I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to tell us a little bit about the work that Ambition Lawrence Weston have been doing, and which was kind of featured within the report as one of the key case studies. I would really recommend reading it there. But David, I'm sure, is going to tell you all that you need to know right now. David.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and Ambition Lawrence Weston for asking me to represent today. So I'm hugely honoured to work with Ambition Lawrence Weston. I've been working with them since 2014, and really how that came about was that I was running a fuel poverty workshop with Bristol Energy Network, and inviting communities from across Bristol to attend that workshop and introduce them to members of the network so they could actually become aware of solutions that community energy could present and offer, and how they could work together with communities. And so Ambition Lawrence Weston invited me to work with them, and so 2 days a week I've been working over the last since 2014-15 with Ambition Lawrence Weston to develop jobs and skills, to develop projects that could lead to jobs and skill development in the future. But primarily, Ambition Lawrence Weston's mission is to improve the health and well-being of its residents, and as a regeneration charity. So their primary interest is about improving the housing stock and making sure there are good job opportunities available for residents in a community where it hasn't always been given the resources it needs to be able to access good jobs and good skills levels for its community that's there. So I've been working closely with Ambition Lawrence Weston, as I say, since 2014, and we started with engaging people with renewable energy through fun activities such as DIY solar panel workshops, such as energy days, and just learning more about energy and introducing those concepts of energy. And we were able, through partnership with Bristol Energy Cooperative, to develop a 4.2 megawatt solar farm across the road from Ambition Lawrence Weston, within the area of Ambition Lawrence Weston, whereby they actually benefit of 50% of those profits over the next 25 years from that development. And that came about partly because of the relationship that Ambition Lawrence Weston had with Bristol Energy Network, who I also work for, and Bristol City Council, being able to negotiate and support that negotiation to allow that land to become available. And as Aisling was pointing out, it's about creating those relationships so that local authorities actually supporting community energy and actually enabling these things to happen. So I will put in the chat a toolkit about how you might actually do that in your own community, because I think this is a climate emergency. This needs to be accelerated. And unfortunately, the support has waned over the years that community energy once enjoyed. It's got a community energy strategy, but it's currently seen as the coalition government's community energy strategy. And we really need government to update the support it has for community energy, so that we actually have a community energy framework for policy that actually supports local authorities so they can deliver community energy projects. There's no urban community energy fund any longer. So projects like bringing forward the wind turbine that I've managed to develop for Ambition Lawrence Weston with Ambition Lawrence Weston might not have happened if that fund wasn't existing, because that was the initial pot of funding that we were able to get the project away. And in communities like Lawrence Weston, that people don't have the ability to pay and invest in something. So it's not an investment model that they need. It's about creating ownership on behalf of that community, and so that wealth and opportunity can be developed through the charity of Ambition Lawrence Weston, which is providing opportunities. And the government's energy white paper points out that they're looking for a smart local energy system, and it's a system of systems. But in those systems, we need people to be part of it. And a smart local energy system needs people to be aware of what that means, an 8-to-80 approach, smart meters actually working and communicating with the renewable energy we generate, so that we can actually supply and pass those benefits on to those people, particularly who have been left behind through the digital divide. And this is where I want to see more support, is support for people to actually be able to access the system. And so I think there's a lot more that government and BEIS can be doing to support community energy. Recently, there was a CFD, Contracts for Difference review for wind turbines. And yet community energy, even though Ambition Lawrence Weston has developed the largest onshore wind turbine in England, it cannot access that market. How can this be the case that we recognise that it's a climate emergency and we're not enabling projects like that to come forwards? There's so many projects that and innovations that community energy is developing, harnessing the skills of the community, so they're actively participating and supporting these projects to happen, and improving the housing stock at the same time. So I really think this report is really crucial timing, and it really needs to be taken serious by all members of the House of Parliament to actually take climate action. We need to see a climate action plan this year, not next year. We need to see community energy right in there, and a framework that supports this activity is COP26. So we really do need to see this translate. We're lucky in Bristol that we've got organisations we work with, including the Centre for Sustainable Energy. We're lucky that we've got a very supportive mayor in Bristol. We've got a citizens' assembly that are aware of what we're doing. So we've got the only citizens' assembly outside of the national one, which has taken witness of what's gone on in community energy in Bristol, and they're fully supporting it. So really excited by the developments that are happening in Bristol. But this can't be just Bristol. It can't just be a Bristol story. It needs to be a national story. And where the initiatives being taken in Bristol, it needs to be matched by the support from national government in terms of infrastructure rollout, ability for everyone to participate. And lastly, I would just say that the poor performance of housing is killing people effectively by not improving the housing stock and not ensuring that people are getting a decent quality of private rented housing. And that's why we've developed the thermal imaging project, the CHEESE project, which we're going to be developing into a national project later this year. So this is where we can actually see the actual problems of poor building monitoring and evaluation of new build and retrofit. So we do need to make sure that these things happen. And the reason why all of this innovation is coming about in Bristol is because we've got a network where communities can talk to each other and actually support and make that thing happen. So Ambition Lawrence Weston is a hugely important part of that story, because it's Ambition Lawrence Weston that's leading the way in its neighbourhood plan, in ensuring that new development coming forward is of passive house standard or near passive house standard, that actually is the best quality housing and encourages renewable energy to happen within the community, and it's active resident participation that's allowing this to happen. So really that's our story. I put some stuff in the chat about some of the things that have happened in Lawrence Weston, and it is genuinely resident led. Really it should be Mark Pepper who's watching this talking to you right now, and here to be able to put it directly to you as to how residents are involved. But we are updating a community plan. We do it every so many years, so we're going to be starting again in May, and we're going to add an additional climate action plan within that, so that we're actually having a climate action plan. And so Lawrence Weston is taking a lead, but it's not the typical leader that you would see in the community in climate change, but it's about health and well-being. And I think if we put health and well-being at the centre of our climate policies, then we'll actually see things being thought through properly, so that we don't end up with promoting diesel cars and finding out there's problems later on. But it's about, if we include health and well-being and fairness in our climate policies, we'll actually see the policies that actually support people in their development. That's all.
Amazing, that's great, David, and that's a message there at the end that really fits well with the agenda of the Environmental Justice Commission, which highlights the fact that we do need to put fairness at the heart of this agenda, ensuring that not just that we're mitigating the worst, but actually maximising the opportunities for everyone, not just because it's the right thing to do, but actually because we won't build the public support that we need for the transition unless we're actually tackling some of the issues that people face in their everyday lives. And that's something that the report shows as well. And before I turn to, we've got quite a lot of questions, which is great. And I'm really pleased to see actually people sharing and responding to other people's questions and sharing resources. It's really great. So we're really pleased that that's happening. And there's a question actually on knowledge sharing in the chat, which I'll come to in a second. But I did want to ask Lucy, Afshin, and David about the motivations of people that are getting involved in these kind of projects, and why you think it is, because I think this is another important message of the report, is highlighting that actually, while a lot of these projects are having benefits for the climate, or in terms of reducing emissions or restoring nature, actually we found that it's not necessarily the primary motivation of people getting involved. And I just wondered whether you had any reflections on that. And I'll come to Lucy, then Afshin, and then David on that point. And Lucy.
Yeah, such an important point. And I mean, obviously the motivations hugely vary from project to project, but I mean, I'd say almost always climate is never the main issue. It might be there, it might obviously be in the backdrop, and it might help kind of spur on action. But Some of the motivations that we found are jobs, creating a local income, either or improving the local area or addressing inequality. So we've heard about fuel poverty, obviously a big driver quite often. And if we look beyond community energy into some of the housing projects and some of the food projects, I'd say inequality and affordability is a kind of common driver. So for the community food projects, it is often about accessibility to affordable, locally grown food, which can be otherwise unaffordable or inaccessible, or accessibility to land to be able to grow your own food. So yeah, I'd say kind of those kind of inequality issues and access and affordability, poverty and jobs, probably I'd say are the kind of common theme across them. But Afshin, do you want to jump in and share your thoughts?
I agree, but I think even within, at least within community energy or our projects, you've got different segments of people being driven by different motivations. We did a survey of our investors, people who are putting money into the schemes and supporting it, and climate was a key driver and motivation for them. Whereas there are many other players in the ecosystem, even in community energy. And yes, creating a fairer energy system is a huge driver. And a lot of people kind of chimed with, we want to break the domination of the existing kind of retailers at the moment, and the system isn't working. And there's there are lots of motivations, but there is I would agree with the sense of that equality, but also people wanting to be locally rooted as well and see something tangibly happen in their local community. And I'm just sharing my own personal kind of reflection from over last year. I feel like we are connecting with our local community in a different way. My local community previously wasn't where I lived. It was where I worked and where I was actively involved in the different communities. But there is this, because we're living in the local area, and this has become our workspace, connecting more to our local area in the physical sense, in the geographical sense as well, is creating a bit of a different shift, at least for me personally. And I feel there is, as an organization as well, we really focused on hyperlocal networks. So there is something about wanting to see positive change happening in your community, and I see that will be growing more. And what we have also seen over the last year is we thought COVID has really dominated, and there's been financial strains, there've been lots of personal disruption in people's lives, but we have seen a huge kind of forthcoming of volunteers and people wanting to actively get involved and use their skills in different ways. And we've also seen people investing in the schemes. So, there's a lot of change happening, and things that we thought, should we go out and raise funds during such a critical, during such a crisis? And actually we were proved, wrong to even doubt ourselves, and the commitment people have to addressing the climate crisis is very much live in people's minds.
Thanks very much, Afshin. David, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think in Lawrence Weston, where I work, it's very much a case about meeting people where their needs are. So understanding that what their needs are and starting with that place. And I think when we did the survey to support the community wind turbine, certainly we weren't just asking one question. We were actually trying to find out where they were at as a community and as individuals, so that we actually understood what their needs were. And I think by doing that, I think it's helping them to understand what their role is in this energy system, and how they are already participating and what support they need. And also you can design projects around their needs, and I think it's that co-design, co-benefit opportunity that having a community energy group within a development charity such as Ambition Lawrence Weston, you actually are able to shape projects around the needs of the community and actually inform that with the technical benefit as well, by having consultant support as well to actually implement those ideas and aspirations that the community have. I've just put in the chat Ambition Lawrence Weston's community plan, and there is a community energy section in there. The first plan didn't have one, but it did identify the poor housing stock and improving that. And then obviously when we're developing the wind turbine project, we actually surveyed again and have got a community energy section in there about the aspirations of the community around what they would like to do. One of those is an energy learning zone. So we've got a concept of a virtual but also a physical space underneath the turbine that will be there. But it's also about that partnership of working with universities and colleges to create a curriculum that will support the next generation of builders and the next generation of IT support that will be needed if the smart energy local system. So I think it's important to have a look at and listen to what people's needs are, and then come back with tangible, practical actions. I think the stress cup of a lot of people is already full, and they want practical solutions. Unfortunately, the solutions that have been offered to date with Green Homes grants and so on, quite often the opportunities there, 70,000 people applying, and only a handful are actually being able to actualize that, and that creates a negative feedback where if you promote a green solution and then the negative feedback follows because a policy is not being particularly well thought through. That's why we need concrete long-term support on policy rather than short start and stop approaches, and really encouraging government to work with us so that these policies actually tangible and meaningful, so that we can actually support communities to deliver on the ground, because I think it's in everyone's interest that people's health and well-being is improved. If we can deliver an energy transition at the same time, that's all the better.
Amazing, thanks, David. So I'm going to come to the chat now, and there's tons of questions. I'm going to pick a couple of our speakers to answer the questions I'm asking, but if any of the others that I've not suggested want to give me a wave because they're really keen to answer that question, or would want to build on something one of the other speakers have said, please do let me know. But I'm going to come to Hilary and Lucy and suggest in this round. There's two related questions, one from Jenny Brooks and one from the National CLT Network. Jenny has said that local action can often be hampered by national planning frameworks. So local councils can be supporting climate action on one side while planning, for example, road schemes on the other. So how can communities find that scope and freedom and autonomy while that national framework exists in its current form? And then the National CLT Network have said that one powerful application of the sectoral voice is where community action again butts up against local and national policy barriers. So for instance, community land trusts being forced to increase car parking and downgrade ambitions by planning authorities, they say, stuck in the last centuries. So two questions there really about the national policy framework, in particular planning, holding up more ambitious local action. Any thoughts on that, Hilary, and then Lucy?
Well, it seems that local authorities are a bit of a theme in those two questions. I must confess that without knowing the details of the community land trust and the car parking issue, I can't immediately see the connection between the two. I wouldn't have thought that was an inevitable consequence of a community land trust, that you will end up with someone telling you more car parks, please. Although when we get to the point of decarbonising motor vehicle transport, then it becomes a different issue. We've improved the air quality, we got rid of the CO2. And depending on where you are in the country, there are plenty of people who absolutely depend on the mobility that their car gives them to go to work and to live their lives. Because of course, not everyone lives in towns and cities. On the planning system, well, this is, in a former life, this is something that Luke and I spent many hours talking about in relation to housing. And I think there is a problem. I'll give you, I mean, housing is one example, but I'll give you another. We tried in Leeds to develop a new generation transport scheme, basically a trolley bus scheme, which was a second best to a rapid transit scheme that was knocked on the head because it was too expensive. And we went through the entire process, and then it went to the planning inspectorate and they said, no. Now there's a problem there. I mean, there's a problem at so many different levels. The first is, if you want people to invest, because you could look at a rapid transit scheme where someone with money would say, well, I'm prepared to invest in this if I can get some or all of the revenue from the fares, and I promise to maintain the system over a 30-year lifespan. But they're never going to do that if they put all the time, effort, energy into preparing the plans, going through the planning process for the planning inspectorate. Now, I'm not having a go at the planning inspectorate, because the planning inspectorate is a place where the local and the national interest has to be played out. And I'll make one other point about that. There's not much point, because they're going to say, can you guarantee me this is going to go ahead? And the answer is, I'm terribly sorry, I can't guarantee you this is going to go ahead, in which case I'll say, well, I'll take my money and my effort and my interest elsewhere. And so I think to incentivize, we need to enable communities to have more certainty about their ability to do things. That's the first point. And the second is, there is always going to be, on occasion, a tension between the local and the national, and we can't run away from it. Now, take HS2, which divides opinion. Obviously, those who are in line of the route really don't like it. But I support HS2 because we need more railway capacities. One of the ways we're going to decarbonize the M1 is to provide more capacity on the railways, because actually, why would you want to spend 4 hours on a Friday evening driving from Leeds to London or London to Leeds, when you can sit on a train and get there in a faster and a more frequent and a more comfortable service? But of course, people will say locally, I don't want it here. And in the end, you have to have a system, whether that is ministers, whether it is a National Infrastructure Commission, whether it is the planning inspectorate, that is going to work out how the two are going to be reconciled. And the same will be true of take the other contentious issue, which is renewable energy generation by wind. There's been a huge raging argument about whether it should be allowed on land. Okay, it's been very successful offshore. I think we're producing more electricity by offshore wind than any other country in Europe. And that was a result of smart regulation. The investment came in, and lo and behold, we're doing really, really well on that front in decarbonising our electricity supply, because we had several weeks last year when we didn't burn a single piece of coal. If you'd said that 30, never mind 50 years ago, people would have said, I'm sorry, you're completely crazy. No way are we going to get to that. Well, we made it happen. So I think we have to recognise, in our genuine, heartfelt enthusiasm for local action, that at times there will be things that the nation requires which may not be popular locally.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Lucy, any thoughts on the planning system in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole nother conversation about the planning system, isn't there? But I mean, I think it's safe to say it's generally, or you could almost describe it as a hostile planning system to community-owned projects, in the sense that it's not been designed. There's little designing in the planning system on the assumption that projects of a significant scale are going to be led by and delivered and owned by a community enterprise, whether that's a land trust or a cooperative, or the different models. And so, as Afshin said, it's an uneven playing field. They're community projects that have huge benefit, huge social and economic and environmental benefits, are pitted against commercial projects that are purely only have, a very limited number of benefits, and often don't bring jobs to the local area. So it is an uneven playing field. But I'd say, and so a huge amount needs to happen to change the policy environment to support more community projects. However, given the situation we're in, given the policy landscape we're in, there is a lot that can be done by creating joint partnerships. And as Afshin said, rather than seeing it as a local community frustrated by a local authority, which is often the case, or a local authority having to engage the community, joint partnerships where the local authority can release land or release assets, or join together on a project where the community can help, and it's a joint venture, is a different mindset. It's a different way of approaching the project, rather than a community having to go it alone and raise all the funds themselves, or a council having to struggle with implementing their climate ambition with all the budget cuts and challenges that involves. So I think those partnerships are going to become more important. And I think the more that happens, the more that makes the case for planning reform, rather than waiting for lobbying for planning reform, and then we'll wait for that, and then we can scale up community action. I think the two have to happen at the same time. We absolutely need to push for more planning reform, but at the same time, there is a lot, even within the constrained system, that can happen, that can be underway. So that's kind of how I see it. I think it is about those partnerships. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucy. David, I've just seen you've come off mic, so I'll just come to you and then go back to the questions. David.
Yeah, I've just posted something in that we did on Costing the Earth, actually, with the cheese project. And that was the national scandal that we're finding of poor performing new build properties. And I think this is the problem. We don't actually have enough investment in our local authorities to actually monitor all of the developments that are going ahead and whether they're actually meeting the design performance. So the design performance gap, we think we're doing really well with our carbon savings and some of these things, but actually we're not doing as well as we should be. And so we do need a new approach and a new deal for buildings in this country. And I think that does need investment and also training of our planning authorities so that they actually are aware of these issues, so that they're properly informed and aware of the new building techniques fully. So I do think that that is something that needs to be looked at. And whilst I appreciate that we do need national infrastructure projects to go ahead, I do think there needs to be proper resources for communities if there's going to be a planning policy to prevent onshore wind to go ahead if you've not got a site selected in your local plan or in a neighbourhood plan. The resources need to be available to either the local authority or to the community to actually undertake the work necessary so that a site does become suitable, as I have done over the last 4 years for Ambition Lawrence Weston. So I think it's about creating the even playing field, you know, allowing communities to participate, not just the big players that are currently run a lot of these systems and housing projects. We need far more CLTs going ahead with, you know, perhaps even infrastructure. A lot of the costs for building houses could be reduced by creating land available for CLTs and actually allaying the services to those building plots. As in Europe, there's quite a lot of higher CLT proportion represented, and we've got some brilliant projects going ahead in Lawrence Weston at the moment. So I think there's a huge amount more that could be done. I think there's some great examples in Lawrence Weston, so I do invite, you know, hopefully Mark's okay to invite people down when it's COVID safe, of course, but to actually see what's going on with projects and actually how policy could reflect better the ambitions that communities have.
Fantastic, thanks, David. I'm going to take a number of questions together. There's Jason's asked a couple, and there's also been a couple in the chat about what knowledge base or toolkits or information is actually available and is out there at the moment for groups looking to, you know, if you're in a local community where maybe not much is going on. So what about what's available? So maybe just pointing people towards anything that you know of is helpful. And I know others have been putting things in the chat, but also really just answering the question, is that something that we need? Do we need more common resources and places for people to go and actually get that knowledge? And there's something there around, Jason's also asked around ensuring the movement is more coordinated. And then separately, and this is something that you touched on, Afshin, Nick has asked about whether the report, and this is probably more for Lucy, but is about whether it looks at the diversity in all senses of people getting involved in community projects, and are there any reflections on that? So I might come to Afshin first, and then Lucy, and then I'll go back and take some more questions unless David or Hilary want to come in on those.
Sure, thanks, Luke. There are resources available, and I think, and just for those of you who are interested in Community Energy England has a how-to webpage on resources and guides. I do agree that there is a need for more interconnections with the networks. We all got our networks, and all, you know, we're constantly creating more web pages and resources online. Probably a bit more interconnection and sharing those resources is needed, but that's where conferences, events are really powerful. And there's nothing like talking to somebody at the other, you know, and in person or at the end of a phone line. And one of the approaches that's been really working successfully in Community Energy is that peer mentoring support. And I've noted that Will, I think from Power to Change, has included a report on that as well, and there's support out there through peer mentoring, again, for community energy. So I think we need to have like a multiple leveled approach to integrate the networks, and I think that's mentioned in your report as well about, you know, the networks really needing to integrate better, and again to also include more inclusive approaches, so that we're also addressing, you know, those inequalities and making sure that everyone's voice is heard. And I just wanted to reflect on our experience. We've, as a cooperative, cooperative, we've embedded those kind of cooperative principles, and values, which is around equality and equity and you know, participation and solidarity. And I think that's quite key with community approaches. We need to embed it in our practices in different ways, where don't only just listen to the loudest voice in the room, but have participatory techniques so that you are able to involve different people through different participatory approaches. So it's not just having meetings, or it could be written, it could be other ways of one-to-one chats. People might not step forward in a group dynamic way. So I think we need to learn and we need to improve in terms of our methods and approaches, and we can definitely do better to become more inclusive and make sure that diversity is reflected. As an organization, Repowering has been very we're really proud about the diversity that we embed in our practices, and you know, living in London probably is easier. Working in Brixton, you know, that's part of our community, but I don't think we have all the answers, and everyone, it's part of civil society. Everyone needs to step up on this particular agenda. It's been quite clear through the whole COVID crisis, Black Lives Matter, you know, it's how do we make our governance improved, more accessible, you know, who sits on our boards to who sits on our committees, how decisions are made. So there's loads. I think you can write another report on that topic altogether. So there's more work to be done. Everyone needs to play their role.
Brilliant. Thanks. Sorry, I'm gonna throw one extra question at you as well. Because Simon has made it's more of a comment. He said, I trust there aren't too many phrases like paradigm shift in the report. He said, if more communities are to be encouraged, then accessibility to issues, discussions is extra. So the reason I raise that is just more how important is language and how we communicate to that issue around inclusion, just to kind of add that in as well.
Yeah, it's a fair point. So we tried to see if there was evidence about diversity in the community space, community action and climate. And frustratingly, there was very little evidence actually of how diverse it is. Partly because of the nature, right? It's so diffuse, and there's such a huge variety of projects, and because it's been so underfunded. So actually, the big national projects that fund community initiatives largely dried up about 10 years ago. We haven't had any big national efforts, which might come with the kind of evaluation and learning budgets attached to them. So there's frustratingly little evidence, but there's definitely some perceptions about lack of diversity, and some of that is no doubt true. You know, as Afshin said, there's no doubt there is more that needs to happen. But I think when we took the broad lens look that we took at to answer the question, we did find a more surprising amount of diversity, both in the sense of, you know, geography, scope, scale, types of people were being engaged, that confounded expectations actually, that it's often, you know, a more narrow segment of society. And that's because of the findings that we talked about, of why projects are being set up for such a huge variety of reasons. So yeah, so that's on diversity, and then the point about how the sort of sector comes together. I mean, there are quite a lot of resources out there. It's been mentioned. There are resources on each sector. So the Community Land Trust has a lot of information. Community Energy England has been mentioned. There are then kind of umbrella groups like Carbon Copy, who are sort of profiling lots of projects across the UK, and then obviously Transition Town, that's been around for quite a long time now, of projects across the UK. So there are, but it's still quite fragmented. I think that's safe to say. And I think it would be great if those sectors came together more. I think it'd be great if we heard a strong voice from community energy and community housing as a collective to really make the case for, as we embark on a huge transition that's going to have to happen. All our housing needs to be upgraded. All of our neighbourhoods are going to have to be transformed if we're serious about climate change in a very rapid timescale. That presents huge challenges and risks, but it is also a huge opportunity. And if we don't make sure that the community sector is up front and playing a role in that, then we can be pretty sure that the transition is not going to be fair, it's not going to be evenly shared, and the benefits are not going to be evenly spread across the country. So I really think it's important the sector comes together as much as possible, but equally that the climate community, sorry, for want of a better word, the climate activists and policymakers also need to understand the importance of community, not as a kind of nice to have voluntary project, but as potentially quite a transformative space to amplify and help with the bigger, harder, government-led initiatives that need to happen. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lucy. It was probably a bit unfair for me to put that question about paradigm shift as well, considering I think I was the one who might have written that particular phrase into the report. But just to reassure Simon, it's definitely not. We've tried to. It's jargon free largely in the report, and hopefully an easy read and lots of information about local community action across the country, as I've already said. I know there's a couple of questions that people have asked about hydrogen. It's not because it's not important, but I know that it invites particular passions, and we will definitely have opportunities to discuss that in other arenas. But I do want, if we can, to focus in particular on community action today. But please do feel free to follow up with us afterwards. There's a couple of questions. I'll come to Hilary first on these, and then me, and then perhaps David and Afshin. One is about is this a substitute? It's quite straightforward for centralised government action. Secondly, there's a question from Carbon Copy about the fact that many local councils have climate action plans and have net zero targets. Many are area wide and not simply council specific. They've asked about how we can make these ambitious area wide plans that need everyone on board the starting point for collaborative local action. So how can we get people on board and everyone involved? And then, yeah, well, I'll stop there and then maybe go to a couple of other questions afterwards. Hilary.
Okay, thanks. No, they're not a substitute for central action. They are a complement to central action, because we need all of the activity, all of the energy, all of the ideas in all of the places that we can muster in order to get to net zero. That's just, for me, that's the long and the short of it. Council versus area plans. The great advantage of having a target, say, that a local authority has committed to, in the same way as having a country that is committed to a zero carbon target, is you've then got a means to try and hold people to account for what they do towards achieving that. Now, if you are the local authority that contains a large steel plant and a cement factory that currently burns coal to make steel and cement, the local authority, let's be honest, doesn't control the way in which those production processes operate. And therefore, to berate the local council for failing to get emissions down because they happen to be home to those two plants, which, by the way, will pay a lot in business rates that the council is reliant on to look after children and elderly people and fill the potholes and all the other things that council have to do, wouldn't really be fair. But there are decisions that councils make that have an impact. I'll give you a very current local example. In Leeds, 2 or so weeks ago, I turned on and watched bits of an 8.5-hour planning committee meeting that was deciding whether to give approval to the Leeds Bradford Airport planning application, which is basically to demolish the existing buildings and build new buildings on the site. Now, in fairness to Leeds Bradford Airport, the new buildings would be a lot more environmentally friendly and lower carbon than the ones they were replacing, but they would be part of a plan to expand the number of flights coming in and out of Leeds Bradford Airport. And that's why I wrote a number of other MPs and other organisations to object to the planning application. Now, it was approved, I think, by 8 or 9 votes to 4, but there's now a campaign to get Robert Jenrick, the Environment Secretary, to call it in. And it's a very good example of choices, because the arguments in favour of granting it were, well, if we don't do this and Leeds Bradford Airport declines, everyone will just drive in their cars to Manchester and get on a plane from there. Well, now that's a good example of why you need a countrywide approach to national infrastructure like that. But in the medium to long term, I have no objection to people flying, as long as the planes can get in the air and take us where we want to go and land again without producing any CO2. None whatsoever. And that is why, and I'm not going to mention the H word again, because I might encourage more criticism in the chat. It's a really interesting debate. But there are a range of technologies that are emerging that might provide a solution to how do we get people in the air to move around the country and the world. But for me, the planning application was important in itself, but it was also quite important symbolically, because it is saying to that sector and that industry, come on, we've got to see where the progress is going to be made on the way in which aircraft take off and land, rather than just say, well, we'll worry about that later. So I think that is the advantage of having objectives that are attached to a place that has a democratic structure, which you can then lobby and argue with and encourage, so things improve.
Perfect, thanks, Hilary. Maybe our next event could be hydrogen or heat pumps with Hilary Benn. I'm sure it'll be a lively debate. I'm just there's a couple of very specific questions on actions by community groups, but I think it'd be really interesting to put to David and Afshin. Of course, feel free to answer as well, either of the two questions I just put to Hilary. There's one question from Jenny Sampson about many community groups taking important action to mitigate climate change, but not being aware of this. She's asked how we could approach helping these groups to understand and articulate their climate impact and build understanding and support amongst the communities that they support. So that's one. And then there's a very specific question on community energy, which is, I imagine getting community energy onto the grid would require network developments in many parts of the UK. Wouldn't this cause costs that are pushed onto the consumer? Therefore, would it be very expensive to create a grid to support many community energy projects? So just a question there about how realistic it is to roll out community energy across the network. David, and then Afshin.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think at the end of the day, what we've got to look at is it is a climate emergency. There are things, I just cover Hilary's one just very quickly, but there are direct emissions that local authority is responsible for, and then there are indirect emissions, and then there's the things that go beyond us. And I think with when we're sort of allowing development or thinking about projects, I think they should be seen in that lens of like how much those organisations are taking responsibility towards a net zero target. And I think that really needs to be clear before they're allowed to develop an expansion of an airport or so on, so we can actually see what their net zero plan is and how they can be held accountable, just as Hilary said, because it's no good allowing something and then finding out there wasn't ever a plan to actually get to that net zero. And they need to be within the time cycles that they can be held accountable, not far away where we can't actually track back and the person that's left that responsibility. So I think it's holding people accountable to the targets that are set are really important. So the question about community energy being deployed across the country, well, I don't think it's an either or. I think it has to happen. I think the top down and the bottom up approaches need to be supported, and I do genuinely think that it doesn't have to cost lots of money if we can create the tools to support communities who are undertaking these mitigation actions, as Jenny pointed out. It's something that Bristol Energy Network is developing at the moment with Bristol University as a tool that will actually allow people to do that. So I'd be happy to talk to Jenny offline about that potentially, and others, because I think this is really there are so many good ideas and solutions coming forward through community energy. To ignore it as a solution is to miss out on harnessing the skills of our communities. Many people have many skills and transferable skills that could be used within their communities. And I think if we create a roadmap for the skills that could be required for a smart local energy system, such as air source heat pump skills, retrofit skills that don't actually exist at the moment, then we'll see we'll actually build back our economy much more stronger and more healthily, and it will meet those needs of and objectives of health and well-being. And actually, how much more do we want to fly if we know that flying is actually going to bring a near end to the whole planet? As it starts, you have to start to actually question how important is your flight for a holiday compared to the actual what we know about climate change now, and can't ignore the science on this. So we need to start actually, I think COVID-19's allowed us to actually value the things that are around us much more and the communities that we live in. And I think we should start with that before we start looking too far beyond our own local horizons. We need to sort out what's going on here and now in our local communities. The fact that people don't have jobs, that don't have food available to them, don't live in warm homes, and that the young people today can't afford their own homes. Those are the home truths right now that we need to address.
Fantastic, thanks, David. Afshin.
Agree with what David said about flying, and really want to echo those thoughts. I mean, I'm someone with my family based in India, and haven't met them, been there for 2 years, and I can see why certain flights will be needed. We live in a global society and community, but we definitely don't need people just jetting away for weekend holidays. And we really need to think about how what are essential flights and what aren't. But just coming to the community energy question, I, again, kind of echoing what David was saying, it's about creating a local smart energy network. And if we're going to move towards a more decentralized energy system, then, community energy offers a lot of solutions and innovations. And I, just linking back to the point I made earlier, is the marketplace and doesn't quite acknowledge or recognize that innovation, doesn't kind of allow it to flourish, and that's what needs changing. There will be infrastructure costs, need to be covered, and it needs to be incorporated. But I think there are other ways in which those costs can be socialized. So let's think out of the box, not based on what the current frameworks are. So let's think beyond. And the point around national government is this to, the recommendations here, what we're talking about to kind of replace or, no, definitely not. It is about complementary. And I think my frustration from both sides, from hearing people in national and local government or in communities, is this is not a them and us. And the scale of the problem that we're facing today in terms of the emergency, climate crisis, we need to collaborate. And I keep saying this everywhere I talk. And this is so essential. If a local authority has access to certain funds and can go ahead with installing solar PV on its housing, then go for it. By all means, let's share what are the other sites the community energy can help you raise finance for. So how can we go from that 1 or 2 megawatts to like 5 megawatts? How do we really have that shared vision? And I think let's all work towards the same outcome, and let's not be precious about territory.
Amazing, thanks, Afshin. And I think on the flying question as well, I think it's important to remember as well, sort of 70% of the flights are taken by 15% of people, and many of them are the kind of wealthiest, and then that's them taking kind of more than 3 flights a year. So there are solutions out there like frequent flyer levies and things like that, which could ensure that it kind of sees a fair way of managing it, as well as thinking about whether we should be expanding airports, etc. There's a couple of other questions that I'm just going to try and sneak in right at the end. One person has asked, and I'm struggling to see it now because there are still many, I'm sorry we won't be able to get through them all. One is someone who was asking about them saying they're not opposed to devolved action and devolution, but are worried about uncoordinated action, and saying that actually local authorities are still the best bodies to be convening this kind of action at a local level. I might come to Lucy on that point. It's Graham who asked that question. And I'm also going to just put Jake's question to you, Lucy. Jake's asked what we think, what will it take for the government to see community energy as having potential to be a mainstream economic and net zero transition model, and therefore give it the policy support needed for that potential to be released?
Yeah, 2 tiny questions. I like it. Okay, so the first on devolution. Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a few things. There's, of course, local authority has a really important role to play, and also has, already existing levers. I think the question of local area plans, neighbourhood plans, and the role of parish councils and the levels below. Yeah, I think it is important, because I think what we're seeing is, whilst there are community projects can happen within the existing framework. We've talked about partnerships that can happen with local authorities. When it gets to the parish council level and below that, I think there does need to be some coherence, and whether that's through devolution or whether that's through planning coherence, let's say, that is quite a significant barrier. On Jake's question, what will it take? That's what we've tried to answer in the report. I mean, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think maybe part of the problem is, I think there's a bit of a misinformation about what we mean by community. So I think, and particularly with community energy, it got associated with the feed-in tariffs, and I've heard a few times misunderstandings that because the feed-in tariff has ended, community renewables are no longer viable, and that's not the case. And it's not true. That's not the situation. The costs of renewables have come down, which is partly why they justified removing feed-in tariffs. But also, projects are still viable. They're still being developed, and so I think maybe the framing to really engage government on community, just community energy, but community housing, etc., is that it unblocks some of the challenges that government are going to face with the net zero transition, right? Planning concerns. There's assumption that there isn't planning support, there isn't support for onshore wind. There is assumption for that. That's not always the case when it's under community ownership, community-owned wind. Very different proposition to a private sector large wind development. So I think understanding and positioning, whether we want to call it community ownership or local commons or however we want to call it, but understanding how that has the potential to really unlock and accelerate the transition that they're going to have to deliver, and that we can see they're already facing some challenges in delivering, because you need to bring everybody alongside of that, because it needs to be supported by the whole of society. And government will be worried about backlash, and they'll be worried about social support for increased ambition. And so I think that, for me, that's a key argument that could help win more government support. But I'd love to know others' thoughts on that.
Amazing, thanks very much, Lucy. I'm conscious of time, so others feel free to answer that question I just put to Lucy as well, if you'd like. But I'm going to ask everyone to give their concluding thoughts now, and maybe just to give their one key takeaway from for those thinking about taking action, or wondering what more their community can do, or whatever. Well, what's the one key takeaway you might and your message of hope for future community action as well. I'm going to come to David first because he's volunteered and he's already taken himself off mic. Probably not to be first with that, but I'm going to put him on the spot.
Well, I will do my closing remark if you like as well. I think personally, I do think there is a problem with export guarantee. There isn't a fixed price for the export of energy. It's causing a massive problem in my wind turbine project. It's not an easy solution. Similarly for on-site generation for solar as well. So if there was something for export guarantee for community energy, it would make a huge difference. And tax relief, as I'm sure Asheen's going to mention as well. So there is stuff that could be done. And I do really encourage BEIS to actually work with local energy hubs so that they can understand those issues at a local level, and actually for a policy level, making sure that sites suitable for wind, that local authorities are actually encouraged to identify those and supported to do that with the communities that are in there. So I do think it is really important that you know, how government works with local communities, and that it's essential that they do work with them. But that's my closing remark, is it needs to be bottom up and top down, and we've got to meet in the middle, and it's a collaboration approach. It's not about one or the other, it's collaboration. And resourcing communities like Lawrence Weston to do it, to be able to participate, because they don't have financial resources themselves, so we need to provide the resources for them to be able to participate, and for all communities to participate, and a roadmap.
Fantastic. Just a few things there. I'm going to ask Hilary now. Hilary.
Look, get stuck in. It's as simple and as challenging and exciting and daunting as that. Because I was just looking at the list of all the people who had signed up to this webinar today. And just judging by the titles, I bet that's what all of you are doing already. And we've heard lots of examples. So spread the word. And if you're looking for inspiration, then find the people who are building the future. Because there's a final point I make is there is a choice we have to make between those, and you do meet them sometimes, who say, oh, we're all doomed, it's too late, it's awful. And well, that isn't going to get us anywhere, is it? I am an optimist. It's why I get up in the morning. And in these circumstances, we should be most interested in the people who are leading the way in showing how that future can be made and what it looks like and how we're going to get there. So all power to Elbow, whatever energy source you may be using to heat your homes. And I could talk at some length about heat pumps as well, if you were interested.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Hilary. I'm about to paste our latest heat pump report on Heatbox in the chat, so people can go away and read that and prepare for the next debate. Lucy, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build on that. Look, we've talked about all the challenges, and there are huge challenges, and there are definitely changes that need to be made by government. But that's the thing about community action, is you don't need to wait for permission. You can get started. And I saw a few comments in the chat about the reliance on voluntary. I mean, yes, a lot of community projects, even the big ambitious ones, often do rely on voluntary support. But obviously it's unsustainable if it's solely relying on voluntary support. Sorry, but a lot of the community energy projects actually have paid professionals. They have staff running the projects. There's a misunderstanding sometimes, I think, and there are lots of models where you can apply for funding for feasibility, for example, in renewable energy, technical support to help you through all the technical challenges around planning and understanding the technological options. And then there are lots of different models for how you can set up a community organisation with paid staff, and that is really important, because obviously you can't do everything for free. So that's the point I'd end on. That you know, do read the report, have a look at the incredible amount of projects, and it really does make you realise once we get together, we can do collectively things that are much harder. Heat pumps is a good example. There are communities coming together to create district heat pumps, basically, so large heat pumps that will serve a whole area. And this is brilliant for communities that can't individually, you might not be able to afford a heat pump in your own house, but if you can come together, you can raise the finance and you can create renewable heating collectively. And I think that's the mindset shift we need to make. We don't have much time on climate change. We need to all start getting involved at our local level, start to make change happen.
Fantastic, thanks, Lucy. And I'll give the final word to Afshin.
Wow. Well, firstly, I really enjoyed the chat, the questions, the debate has been really fantastic. And I think my contribution really is connect with the people, community energy groups, or your local community group, whatever they're doing, start taking action, be disruptive, show government the solutions. And my ask to government really is, be it national or local, is that we're in a climate crisis. It's an emergency. People have declared emergencies. Please don't deal with it with business as usual. We know you can do different. So let's treat the climate crisis the way it meant, and find the solutions and scale up very quickly. That's what's needed.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Afshin. And thanks to everyone who's joined today. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm sorry we haven't managed to get through all of them, but we managed to get through many of them, I hope. So thanks very much. Do keep looking out for the work coming out from IPPR and our Environmental Justice Commission, of which Hilary is a co-chair, alongside the Green Party's Caroline Lucas and the Conservatives' Laura Sandys. But I hope to see you again soon. Do keep looking out for our work, and thanks again to Local Trust for their support for this piece of work. But thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.